On this episode of China Uncensored, anti-China protests in Vietnam explode into street violence. Hi, welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Anti-China protests broke out in Vietnam this past weekend. People charged through barricades. Riot police showed up in full force. People threw stuff at the police. The police charged at the people and dragged some of them away. Let's just say there were reports of police brutality. A citizen journalist posted this video with the caption, "Protesters are being killed by the Vietnamese Communist government." And at least one kid was so upset by the whole thing that he couldn't hold back his tears. I think he's crying because so many people were shooting vertical video. Hold your phone horizontally, people, horizontally. Now, viral social media moments aside, protests in Vietnam are actually fairly common. It's a communist regime, and that typically means no shortage of reasons for people to get upset. And since Facebook is popular in Vietnam, a lot of people there are organizing protests using Facebook and uploading their vertical videos by the thousands. Anyway, we're talking about these particular protests because they were fueled mainly by anti-China sentiment. The Vietnamese government wants to pass a law creating special economic zones. These are places where foreign companies get special incentives and fewer restrictions to set up factories. Factories the size of small cities. A bit like the infamous Foxconn factory in China, where workers were so happy they were jumping for joy out of windows, which is why the company had to install suicide nets. But it isn't bad working conditions Vietnamese protesters are worried about. They're worried that the Vietnamese government's special economic zones will be dominated by Chinese companies, giving the Chinese regime too much power and influence. One of these specific things was the idea that Chinese companies could lease land in these zones for up to 99 years. I mean, it's not like that's ever happened before, right? Right. But with anti-China sentiment running high in Vietnam, it didn't take much for violence to erupt. Even though most protesters were peaceful, all it takes is a few bad eggs and a small pile of rocks. People in Vietnam are already angry with China over South China Sea disputes. Vietnam has a long-standing claim that's being aggressively challenged by the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese military has built artificial islands on outcrops and then turned these islands into weaponized fortresses. And they spray Vietnamese ships with water cannons when they get too close. So it's little wonder that anti-China sentiment is running high in Vietnam. And when you're angry at the actions of the Chinese regime, it's easy for that idea to bleed into being angry at China as a country and even at Chinese people. This protest banner says, "No leasing land to China even for one day." The Chinese embassy even issued a warning to Chinese citizens in Vietnam to be careful. And in a statement that doesn't at all make it appear that China is interfering in the internal affairs of another country, the embassy blasted the protests for having anti-China content and called them illegal. Well, amazingly, the protests over the weekend seem to have worked. Partly. On Monday, Vietnam's National Assembly agreed to delay their vote on the Special Economic Zone bill. Because why deal with problems today that you can put off into the future? Possibly in a sneaky way that doesn't arouse so much protest. So, problem solved. Except, there's more to it than that. There's another element to the protests. They were also calling out a dangerous new cybersecurity bill. As much as the Vietnamese regime hates how the Chinese Communist Party acts in the South China Sea, they love how they do cybersecurity. Vietnam's National Assembly had plans to enact a harsh new law straight out of the Chinese regime's playbook. It would give Vietnamese authorities wide discretion to determine when online expression must be censored as illegal. It would also help them stifle dissent by forcing internet providers to remove offending content, and it would require providers to give user data to authorities without a court order. The US and Canada have both officially urged Vietnam to delay passing this law. Amnesty International warned that this could turn companies into state surveillance agents. And so a lot of protesters were upset about this too. And it turns out they were right to be upset, since on Tuesday, Vietnamese authorities did pass the cybersecurity law, although it doesn't officially go into effect until January 1st, 2019. But in a weird twist, there's also a conspiracy theory that these protests could have been a false flag created by the Vietnamese regime. Specifically, it says that Vietnamese authorities planted people to make sure the anti-China protests turned violent. That way, they'd have an excuse to crack down harder, and, more importantly, have an excuse to say, see, Vietnam needs a new cybersecurity law because you people are using the internet to organize your violent protests. Now that's just a theory so far, and I haven't seen solid evidence, but it's not inconceivable that an oppressive communist regime would be willing to use underhanded tactics to get what it wants. And while it's unclear whether any part of the protests were actually orchestrated by the Vietnamese regime, one thing does seem pretty clear. Now that the cybersecurity law has been passed, this could be one of the last times the public gets to see videos of protests in Vietnam. So what do you think about the protests that rocked Vietnam over the weekend? Leave your comments below. And before you go, it's time for me to answer another question from a China Uncensored fan on Patreon. Forrest Goodman asks, will the corruption in the CCP ever reach a breaking point and collapse, or is the party just too big to fail? That's the million RMB question, Forrest. People have been predicting for a long time the fall of the Chinese Communist Party. And it makes sense. Rampant corruption, shadow banking, a housing bubble, capital flight, those are just a few of the issues that threaten to tank the economy. Not to mention, every year, there's about 200,000 mass protests across the country. Even communist officials talk about the danger the party faces. But if the party were a boat on the ocean, it's done a remarkable job duct taping up any leaks. That's the kind of power an authoritarian regime has. But its iron grip is exactly the reason all these problems keep popping up. The party is big, but you know what they say. The bigger you are, the harder you fall. It's only a matter of when. Thanks again for your question. And remember, if you support China Uncensored by contributing to our Patreon website, you can ask me any question you want, and I'll answer them on the show. If you're interested in becoming a supporter of China Uncensored, click the link below to go to our Patreon website. And if you're already a supporter, leave your question for us there. Also, people have been complaining that YouTube isn't notifying them when a new episode is up. So be sure to enable that bell icon so you get the latest from China Uncensored. Thanks for watching. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Chappell. See you next time. Thanks for watching. China Uncensored is supported mainly through contributions from viewers like you. Without our viewer support, we'd have to stop the show. So click this orange button and visit patreon.com/China Uncensored. You can contribute $1 or more per episode. You can also set a monthly limit if you need. When you join, we'll give you some cool perks, and you'll be making a big difference for us.